Climate change is a problem that we as a global community face today. Throughout history, the Earth has gone through different climate cycles, with periods of both cold temperature and warm temperature. However, since the beginning of the 20th century, when major global industrialization skyrocketed, Earth's average temperature has risen by over 1 degree. This small figure has led to big impacts, with conditions worsening as the temperature of our world continues to climb. Climate change is no longer a distant theory. Following Hurricane Sandy and Super Typhoon Haiyan, two extreme weather events that affected the United States and Vietnam, the Philippines, and Micronesia, we as a contemporary society are now beginning to realize the fear and realities of the uncontrollable future of our planet. This will continue to worsen if more extreme measures to reduce the rate of climate change aren't implemented immediately. 20% of the world's population is responsible for 80% of total carbon emissions, and our lowest developed countries are the ones most heavily affected. The UN classifies least developed countries, or LDCs, as countries with low income that face severe structural handicaps to economic growth and development and need access to support beyond what is commonly available for all developing countries. The UN released a list of LDCs, and on it are the names of 48 countries, including Ethiopia, Tuvalu, and Yemen. In this presentation, the repercussions of climate change will be explored through the case studies of the LDCs Ethiopia, Tuvalu, and Yemen. In Ethiopia, the unpredictable rainfall arriving late in the monsoon season, longer-lasting climate-induced drought, failing crops, and dying livestock will be addressed. Furthermore, required adaptation measures such as drought-resistant crops, pastoral change, and the restrictions imposed by poverty will be explored. In Tuvalu, due to climate change, the migration of citizens due to rising sea levels and the financial restraints preventing people from seeking refuge elsewhere are becoming serious problems. Furthermore, extreme weather events that are immensely impacting the island nation and its inhabitants as well as the agriculture will be addressed. Finally, the Prime Minister's stance on the issue and the attempts that have been made to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions as significant targets will be explored. Similarly, Yemen's position as a stakeholder will be analysed in relation to its political structure and response to climate change. It is now evident that climate change is having a detrimental impact on Yemen's agriculture, water resources, coastal zones, and nationwide health levels. As a stakeholder in climate change, LDCs are a group which are misrepresented and neglected amongst the larger stakeholder groups. Although LDCs collectively emit the lowest levels of carbon, they are the countries which are suffering the consequences of climate change. With often poor governance and the financial inability to implement means of reducing the effects of climate change felt firsthand by the LDC populations, this stakeholder group requires support through governance and funding to reduce vulnerability to changing climate change policy and increase adaptability to these rapid environmental changes. We will now look in further detail at the countries Tuvalu, Kenya, and Yemen and explore their standpoints as LDC stakeholders in the climate change debate and the repercussions that climate change is having on the land and its people.
As the stakeholder representative for Ethiopia, I aim to present information to you regarding our position as one of 34 African countries included in the United Nations list of lowest developed countries. With just one event of global warming comes an avalanche of related issues. The unpredictability of rainfall patterns has a domino effect on the large majority of Ethiopia's ability to function. Crop failure, drought, flooding, food shortage, economic instability, and social unrest are the most pressing and fundamental elements we aim to present in order to relay the importance and necessity for immediate and drastic action to be taken by all stakeholders on this global issue of climate change. We are arguably the most at-risk country in terms of impacts on agriculture and in turn economy. With a population of over 99 million, 80% of the job market in agricultural production, and 46% of the country's GDP generated from agricultural production, the changes in weather patterns is leading to and will continue to lead to absolute failures in societal stability. Changes in air temperature and the consequent unpredictability of rainfall and increases in drought cycle patterns are ravaging Ethiopian industry. Africa as a whole does not have complex irrigation systems in place, so their reliance is squarely on steady rainfall. For 90% of cereal crops in sub-Saharan Africa, rain is the sole source of water. Droughts are becoming increasingly disastrous. Crop failures and the consequent food shortage and famine are on the rise with the increase in severity and frequency of drought periods. Another huge problem is climate change-induced conflict. Conflict can rise due to a number of stimuli such as economic instability due to poor quality crops, resulting in tensions over the limited natural resources, infighting between people fleeing infertile lands, and civil unrest from a loss of faith in the government's ability to manage and assist. Civil unrest, violent demonstrations, and tempers running high because of lack of resources would have enormous and devastating effects on the population. Conflict between northern Kenya, southern Sudan, and southern Ethiopia were in large part because of disputes over access to pasture and water. With conflict like this comes physical injury, malnutrition, psychological damage, displacement, and most cripplingly, the continuous stagnation of social progress. In a country with numerous issues involving the violent behaviour of its citizens, climate-exacerbated frustrations and fear are placing increasing strains on the mood and common security of the Ethiopian people. In attempts to curtail some of these consequences, smaller-scale farmers have implemented adaptation practices to replace their traditional pre-global warming farming methods. Some of these measures include planting drought-resistant crops, altering the planting and harvesting timelines to align with changes in rainfall patterns, and introducing methods of water and soil conservation. These methods have been undertaken as a means to adapt to climate change as a channel for profit and financial survival. For these farmers, crop yield and the success of harvest is their sole livelihood to provide for their families. Adaptive capacity is an issue. The ability for the Ethiopian layperson to implement coping strategies is highly dependent on each individual situation. Getting rid of livestock as a way of covering costs lost by a crop failure can cause poverty traps if this cycle is continued. On a national level, Ethiopia is aiming to become a middle-income nation by the year 2025 through the implementation of the climate-resilient green economy strategy, put in place in 2011. This strategy has three key aims. 1. Faster growth and economic development. 2. Managing greenhouse emissions. And 3. Improving overall resilience to climate change. During the development process for forming the strategy, committees of specialized governmental officials were formed to oversee that the critical issues are each properly addressed. While the Ethiopian government has made serious and extensive efforts into counteracting the effects of climate change, it is still not enough. Financial assistance is still required to achieve the level of intervention necessary to be most effective. Ethiopia's ability to achieve real change is small. We simply do not have the resources necessary to effect substantial environmental progress. We would therefore implore all developed nations to take our current predicament into consideration and put real and substantial efforts into fulfilling the Paris Agreement in providing financial assistance and helping strengthen our governing practices. With this help, we as a nation will have the capability to adapt more wholly to the effects of climate change.
Tuvalu, our island nation comprised of 9 small Pacific islands, has become an increasingly vulnerable target to climate change and has been a communicative member of the least developed countries in the stakeholder campaign. Our defenseless and remote location, midway between Australia and Hawaii, has resulted in agricultural unproductivity, economic insecurity, and endangerment of our country's 9,970 inhabitants. Intensified weather events that have occurred in response to climate change have immensely impacted our isolated islands and people. The thawing of glaciers has caused an unwelcome rise in sea levels and as a result has further submerged the already low-lying islands of Tuvalu. It's been estimated this year in 2017 that Tuvalu is no more than 4.6 meters above sea level and does not exceed this value even at its highest point. According to scientists, there is the possibility of sea level rise of 1 meter this century, meaning that there will be an inundation of people in the center of each island. In 1997 alone, Tuvalu lost 50 hectares of land due to tropical storms and rising sea levels. Constant threat of coastal erosion and eventual full submergence is one of our country's main concerns.
Natural breakwaters have always played a pivotal role in the protection of our people. These essential barriers have been successful in reducing the force of storms and floods and lessening the overall erosion of our 9 islands. Climate change not only has reduced the number of natural breakwaters and the strength of the remaining few, but has further increased the intensity and overall frequency of floods and tropical cyclones. Our country was hit by 35 tropical cyclones between 1969 and 2010, and although it is expected that the number of annual tropical cyclones will decrease, average wind speeds of future cyclones will increase by approximately 11%, resulting in more severe damage to housing and agriculture. Our people heavily rely on the surrounding ocean and ecosystems for their survival. With increasing sea levels, increasing temperatures, and ocean acidification, large irreparable losses of aquatic species have occurred and further resulted in a declining abundance of fish. The fish industry is the main source of income for 80% of our population, and due to the recently altered migration patterns of tuna and their low abundance, starvation has become prevalent. Our infertile land, its increasing salinization, crop absorption of carbon dioxide, and increasing temperatures have further reduced our annual agricultural crop intake. Additionally, contamination of our freshwater in coral atolls has put a strain on our people. According to Francois Geminet, an environmental geopolitics specialist, Tuvalu is expected to become uninhabitable by 2050, which is why we are in desperate need of a global solution. Not many solutions are available for Tuvalu. However, the first is the ratification of the Kyoto Protocol, and the second is migration. The Kyoto Protocol ensures the reduction of global greenhouse gas emissions and has currently been ratified by 192 countries, excluding Afghanistan, Sudan, and the US. Our Prime Minister, Salvatore Sopoaga, has pleaded that the US ratifies the Kyoto Protocol as it is one of the world's top contributors to greenhouse gas emissions and will have the biggest impact on our people. Migration will not be a very viable option, as financial restraints and refusal to abandon our land and culture have prevented the venturing of most peoples. Finally, our only hope is that we can extend the period of time in which our island remains above water. This can be done through financial funding from other countries to improve our water collection methods, the creation of better adaptation strategies, and finally, widespread plantation of salt-tolerant crops. Next, we will be discussing Yemen.
Yemen is situated in South Arabia and is one of the poorest and most water insecure countries in the North African region and Middle East. Our capital, Sana'a, is currently under rebel control and has been since early 2015. Over half of our population live on incomes below the poverty line. Our total greenhouse gas emissions in 2012 stood at 0.07% of global GHG. To put this into perspective, on a ranking of the world's countries by 2014 per capita fossil fuel CO2 emission rates, we stood as the 166th largest contributor with just 0.24 metric tonnes of carbon compared to, say, Australia, ranked at 15th, contributing 4.12 metric tonnes of carbon per capita. This highlights the fact that it is often those countries who are least responsible for global warming that are often affected by it most. We are affected by climate change as droughts are a more frequent occurrence and have contributed to the increased prevalence of food shortages. We have also experienced an unusually strong cyclone Chapala in 2015. This also led to widespread flooding. According to USAID findings, there has been a significant impact on our sectors, including agriculture, which has seen decreases in agricultural productivity, high occurrences of soil erosion, and urbanisation due to crop losses. Our water resources have also suffered, with a lack of access to safe drinking water increasing and therefore heightened conflict over water. Our coastal zones have too suffered, with the degrading of coastal ecosystems and low-lying areas, rapid coastal erosion, and reduced fisheries and thriving economic livelihoods as a result. Also important is the impact climate change has had on health. In particular, reduced quality and quantity of safe drinking water, which often leads to increased risks of waterborne and vector-borne illnesses. Also, increased food insecurity leading to serious cases of malnutrition, particularly for our children. The EPA was established in Yemen during 2003 in order to build, implement, inspect and enforce environmental strategies and policies for our country. This also includes coordinating regional, national and international action on environmental protection. We have also ratified the UN Framework Convention of Climate Change, as well as the Kyoto Protocol, and the EPA serves as a focal point for our implementation. Our nation has initiated a process in establishing legislation, institutional and policy frameworks in order to meet the requirements of the Convention and the Protocol. With support from international development partners such as the United Nations Development Programme, Global Environment Facility and the World Bank. 2009 marked the year of an established Interministerial Committee for Climate Change, which would seek to strengthen national coordination and climate change leadership for our country. However, there still remains limits in our ability to respond to climate change as we experience weak institutional structures, a lack of access to climate information, inadequate institutional, technical and financial capacity, and a lack of funding for implementing climate change programs. Although our country is allowed to participate in the climate change negotiations as a legitimate stakeholder, it does not necessarily mean that our voice is heard. We often feel left out and tend to disagree with most other stakeholders. We argue that even the internationally accepted 2-degree rise means many unnecessary deaths for our populations, and think that it is a type of climate fascism enforced by rich countries. The latest Durban Climate Change Conference also showed no promise of providing technological and financial resources to least developed countries like us. Solutions discussed for the climate change in our country include technical solutions revolving around the development of a desalination plant. However, we have come across concerns with feasibility and the ability to gain funding. Political solutions including more peace talks between parties of the ongoing civil war, as well as working with both the United States and Saudi Arabia, who show most interest in our water crisis, will help address our problem. All that being said, it is ever so crucial that a more competent government comes into power if we are to see any significant solutions.
It is our understanding as a stakeholder that climate change is being directly and heavily influenced by the activities of humans. As has been made clear by our previous representatives, the least developed countries are simultaneously at the highest threat from the impact of climate change and have the lowest capacity to mitigate or adapt to these changes. It has also been demonstrated that the countries that fall into the least developed category are almost always responsible for the least emissions and global impact. While the LDCs have negligible influence on the climate, the influence that the climate can exert over the LDCs are varied and drastic, be it starvation from crop failure, political tension and civil war over limited natural resources, or displacement of people from rising sea levels. The common thread among our nations is the extreme vulnerability to climate change, as well as a lack of capacity to deal with the ocean of issues that a rapidly changing climate can produce. The countries our coalition represents all suffer from a variety of pre-existing environmental, economic and social issues, and as demonstrated by previous speakers, no other nation on this planet are more vulnerable to the repercussions of a changing climate. The socio-economic issues that affect our collective nations will no doubt be exacerbated by a rapidly changing climate. As nations that stand on the front line of climate change, we are already experiencing its advance and we cannot afford to ignore its threat. Our coalition of LDCs has a small voice on the global stage, yet the individuals who comprise of our nations stand to suffer the most from the emissions of global industrialization. We do not have the economic prowess to sway corporations, and we do not feel that we have the political influence required to change the targets that have been set by the international community, although we disagree with these targets and feel that more stringent goals should be agreed upon. We feel that we must make a plea to the international community. We need every ounce of available effort to be dedicated to implementing effective methods of mitigating the onset of anthropogenic climate change. There are measures of adaptation to climate that have been implemented by many of the LDCs, but many of the countries in our coalition rely on foreign aid to ensure that the basic needs of our citizens are being met. We are deeply grateful to the global community for this. However, we feel that this aid can and should be increased as well as redirected. Rather than temporary solutions, we ask that the global community commits to investing in climate aid that will help LDCs develop preventative measures, such as infrastructure and contingency plans. We understand that on the surface this request may seem excessive, but as things stand, we are unable to deal with a rapidly changing climate and its economic, humanitarian, and geographical impact. Prevention is the only approach when there is no cure.